All right, you've been listening to Sunny Williams and Butch Wilmore, two NASA astronauts who have been stuck on the International Space Station since early June. That's when they arrived there on the Boeing Starliner. However, there were some problems, some helium leaks and thruster problems. At first, they thought that they were going to be able to return on the Starliner. However, you heard them talk there, Butch explaining that they found some things that they couldn't get comfortable with on the timeline that they needed to. He said perhaps if they'd had more time and they could have done all of the tests that they wanted to, that they could have felt comfortable taking the Starliner back to Earth. However, that wasn't the case. And in fact, the Starliner returned home without the two astronauts just last week. So there they are at the International Space Station, and they will be there until they can catch a ride home with a crew of a SpaceX craft, and that's not going to happen until February of next year. For his reaction to this, let's bring in Dr. Adam Sirek of Western University. He's been listening along with us. He's also with the Canadian Society of Aerospace Medicine, and he joins us from London, Ontario. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here, and I'm joining you from the London Air Show at London Airport.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, it looks like quite the place to be right now, and quite the place to be for these astronauts for an extended period of time. Instead of about 8 days, they're going to be there for 8 months. Interesting, none of the questions that we heard so far in the press conference there were about their health, though there were some questions about mental health, essentially. How are they psychologically dealing with the idea that they're not going to be going home until next year? That jumped out to me. I wonder what you made of how resilient they sounded in their approach to this.
Well, and I think that's a great point. These are resilient people. These are test pilots. They know that the ship that they're flying, they are testing, is never been done. What they're doing is unique. And so a right shift of a timeline for astronauts is not an odd thing. I worked a mission just recently, one of the first private missions to the International Space Station, the Axiom 1 mission, and the timelines were extended because of little things that come up and things that need to shift. Now, going from 8 days to 8 months, maybe a little bit more, and it's true. The big change is probably going to be how are they going to react mentally, how are their families going to handle it, and that emphasis on behavioral and mental health is really important.
And what about the physical impact here? Because, I know that they do a lot of training for what they need to do, in terms of their body being able to handle these conditions as well. But for it to go from being just over a week to being 8 months, does that have, a greater impact on the body? Would they have trained differently for that type of mission?
They wouldn't have necessarily pre-trained differently, but it is a bit of a change from a sprint to a marathon. And so what they're going to need to do now is going to be different, because the short duration trip, they may not need to have as much time booked on the exercise equipment. There's a limited amount of exercise equipment on station, and all the astronauts need to use it, and it's blocked into their schedules. Now we're talking about adding more people to crew for a much longer period of time, which means everyone's going to have less time on it, and they're going to need to spend more time protecting those bones and those muscles and ensuring they have the right nutrition so that when they come back to Earth, they are less deconditioned and they're ready to get back up into space faster.
Yeah, tell us more about the potential for bone and muscle mass loss here.
So this is a really neat thing, and a lot of research has gone into this over many decades now at this point in time. And we've got a lot more of an understanding of how the bones and the muscles change in space, and what we can do are countermeasures, we call them, to help keep people healthy. And so the current protocols that we have in space and are used on space station by the USOS, so essentially the American and the Allied astronauts, prevent any major issues in the bone or the muscle. We do see some changes, but we don't see anything that causes us major concerns medically when they come back down to Earth. And then they work with special astronaut trainers, or basically like really fancy advanced physiotherapists, so that these astronauts are back and driving and doing things, going into the office within days of returning to Earth.
What about eyesight? I've read that that's something that can be a concern too.
Yeah, so the spaceflight associated neuro-ophthalmic syndrome, or SANS, is one of the major topics that we just don't truly understand. And this is why medicine and research is great in space, because when you take away gravity and you add radiation, all the unique things that make the space environment so dangerous, not just to the machine, but also to the biological machine, the human who's in space, we get these weird changes. And so we don't truly understand what is causing it yet, but there are protocols in space, and astronauts and Sunny and Butch will be included in this, where they will be doing continuous monitoring and scans to observe their ocular health and the changes, so that then we can ensure that they have good health when they come down. The nice thing about SANS at this point in time is that we don't have anyone with any major permanent changes to their vision, but we need to know if we're going to Mars for a 3-year trip, what's going to happen.
So when you heard about, initially when you heard about the extension of this trip, of this mission for these two, did you have concerns?
So honestly, no. This is something that NASA and the team are good at. It is long duration missions. We've done year-long missions. We've had a lot of people fly in space for a very long time. So in terms of the physiology and the machine of the body, I didn't have concerns. The concern that would be there is that rapid shift in the plan. You went from 8 days to 8 months. They talked about their voting cards. They talked about things for their family and setting that up. That may not have been fully in place for something that was going to be 8 months long. As they indicated, they're in the military. They've done deployments before. They're used to the return home date changing, but changing by this much is maybe something they weren't quite prepared for.
Dr. Sirek, I understand that you were one of the top 20 finalists in the Canadian Space Agency astronaut recruitment program back in 2016, 2017. Is this something that you thought about, the idea, or that the recruits were encouraged to think about this possibility of having a mission turn into something that they didn't expect it to be at the beginning? Were you pushed to sort of stretch yourself in that way, to stretch your mind?
We certainly were, and I think we as Canadians can be very proud of the Canadian Space Agency and the effort they put into selecting our astronauts. I'm lucky to know a number of the Canadian astronauts, and they are all fantastic people. And yes, from the beginning of recruiting people and offering this as a potential job, we had to make that thought process of, this is not just a regular desk job. This is not just a government position. This is something very dangerous. You are sitting on top of essentially something that was meant to launch bombs across the world. It's now a rocket carrying you into space. It is very dangerous. It is made as safe as possible, but there is always risk. And whether that risk is you're gone longer than you thought, or potentially you perish in this, is this something you're willing to do, a risk you're willing to take to push in advance what humans can do and continue pushing that boundary, as they said, of test, but also just human exploration.
And Butch and Sunny were recognizing that risky component of it absolutely as well today, too. Doctor, thank you so much for your time and your reflection there on the recruitment process a few years ago. I really appreciate your perspective.
Happy to be here, happy to talk about it, and wish two of them the best.
That's Dr. Adam Sirek in London, Ontario.